Hey guys, what's up? In this video today we're going to be covering biblical poetry, and specifically elements of parallelism and its historical interpretation through rabbinical circles, which is like with the Jews, and within the Greco-Roman circles within the church. I've kind of been on this video for a while. It's been a big project, but I hope you guys enjoy. Just like or leave a comment. So let's get in. Alright, so here is my table of contents. And I also just wanted to say I'm not trying to make money off this PowerPoint just in case someone tries to give me trouble. Here are also the main books that I'm using during this presentation. Theories on poetry. So the first one is the Emotive Theory, and this is proposed in the first book that I mentioned, the green one. And it emphasizes that poetry is a form of discourse that expresses powerful or profound human emotions and feelings, designed in a way to provoke and stimulate emotion, right? So, emotive emotion, right? That's the point of poetry, right? Second, mimetic theory. The poem is the copy, the mirror, the representation. Therefore, this theory focuses on the relationship between poem, imitation, and the world, that which is imitated. How well the imitation represents reality becomes the mode of valuation. Whether the representation is of a transcendent reality or a mundane beauty, poetic mirrors permit a creative and provocative glimpse of reality, not found in other forms of expression. So what's also interesting is, I'm sure most of the people listening here are younger, so I mean, obviously you know what a meme is. The word meme is originally Greek, and it actually means reflection. So it's interesting thing about, like, mimetic memes, memes are that which, best portray, a situation or just something funny, right? So that's just, I guess, something to keep in mind. But yeah, mimetic, best imitation of reality. Number 3, goal-orientated theory. So this one moves beyond imitation to focus on the rhetorical effect of a poem's persuasion and on the end to which a poem is directed. So rhetorical just means of rhetoric, right? Of some literary device or techniques. So a poem is then structured, a structure tailored to strengthen a book's desired end or goal. The summation of this telos, whatever, is brought about through various mediums such as emphasis, repetition, and reiteration. Literary designs like these are prime examples used to further ensure an audience's attention and reception. So here basically it's saying what we find in poetry today is practically an ornament or a piece of literature that best adorns the author's intended goal or intended message, right? It simply just helps the author bring about, or better bring about, his or her message. Number 4, objective theory. The events of the story lead to a natural response, and the reader or observer can relate and presumably would take similar actions given the same set of circumstances. According to Eliot, the poet carries within his mind the multiplicity of experiences, thoughts, emotions, upon which the poet imposes order, and from which emerges a unity. Thus it is a new artistic emotion, created unique to the poem. Therefore, the critic is to judge a poem based on objective rationality of the unity created. In other words, does the poem present a whole unit of intelligibility produced from a multiplicity of separate parts? So with this one, I mean, it goes on. You can skip it. You can pause the next slide if you want to. But practically, the way that I understand this theory is just that, is the story well written to the point where, it's meaningful, it's relatable, it's personal. It's not just some, what's that word? It's not far off. It's not a fantasy. It's personal. It's relatable, applicable. Number 5, indeterminacy theory. The poem is a self-contained newer reality with indeterminate, even conflicting power for the reader. The reader may be understood as the poet. The one who reads also writes/concludes the text. The poem is neither an imitation of reality, a spontaneous expression, nor the result of manipulating some external elements. To interpret a poem in this sense is contradictory. Self-contradiction is the very language of poetry. Debatable, but at least I'm just quoting. And the theory of poetry must in itself be poetic. This quotation in itself, or this belief, is Aristotelian. Follows some very previous Aristotle ideas, but we'll get into that later a little bit. Nonetheless, this is just a modern and unpopular form of interpretation among today's scholars. Being that it's relativistic, it can just naturally lead to cynicism, in that how do you interpret a text how do you draw perhaps an absolute, definitive answer from a text if the text itself is, or the meaning of the text is completely up to your own perspective. It's, I guess, not even within the realm of analogy. So I think this one is important to note. It's the way that I understand it is a form of eisegesis, where the meaning is inspired by the imposition of modernity's hermeneutics, postmodernism, relativism, So just an important note. Points of vantage: help for interpretation and identifying pattern and structure. The interrelatedness of poet and poem, the expression of either direct or indirect value, the glimpse, sometimes given in the poem, of the process that called forth the poem, the role of the reader. So pretty much, if you are interested in studying a poetic piece, these 4 points may aid you. Approaches to interpreting Hebrew poetry. Prosody analysis of poetry consists of metric analysis and structure, analysis of similar ancient Near Eastern text to that of Hebrew, such as Ugaritic, and grammatical functionality. So we're going to be covering this, but the what is known as the subjunction of B to A, which is the syntactical, or the connection within the syntax between the two clauses, and we'll look at that later. But second point, right? Second point is the Bible as literature, the interpretive categories of those of the literary critic, for example, the analysis of characterization, plot, theme, motive, symbolism, and the like. Third, the learned interpretation of canonical literature. Authors of such commentaries, whether ancient or moderns, were interested in explicating the meaning or meanings of the text by utilizing whatever perspectives, allegorical, philological, historical, critical, or theological, they deemed appropriate, right? So the historical, what has been passed on through, traditions or peoples, right? That sort of understanding. Parallelismus of Robert Loth, 16th century. Definition, this is according to him: the dominant feature of that literature, poetry, consists chiefly in a certain quality, resemblance, or parallelism between the members of each period, so that in two lines, or members of the same period, things for the most part shall answer to things, and words to words, as if fitted to each other by a kind of rule or measure. So Robert Loth also identifies B subjunction to A within the syntax, which is important to note. That we'll explain later, but just an important note for now. And he also receives a lot of criticism in Kugel's perspective, which we'll also do, but for now let's just continue, right? Most modern scholars side in the absence of meter from poetry. Meter is defined as the more or less regular poetic rhythm, the measurable rhythmical patterns manifested in verse, the ideal patterns which poetic rhythms approximate. To break this down, rhythm exists in poetry, as also in prose and everyday speech. So it is not an exclusive feature of poetry. Rhythm can be defined as any sequence perceptible as a distinct pattern capable of repetition and variation. These stressed and unstressed vowels, when ordered and seen to be repetitive, create meter. However, this repetition of stress is perceived as absent from scripture, aside from a small handful of verses. So practically, as I speak, my words have stressed and unstressed syllables, and that unorganized syllabic or syllable rhythm is, or syllable order is rhythm. But when you order it to follow maybe 2 or 3 stress syllables or whatever, then it becomes meter. What's important to note is that Robert Loth himself coined the term parallelism, paralleloid as well, and he wasn't the first to discover it as it's as one dives into the study, and that seems to be a certain theme that comes up a lot. And so in having coined the term, considering it in an a priori sense, I don't mean to be wordy, but it connotates a certain sense of I guess information that doesn't always adhere to its actual structure. When I hear the term parallelism, I think of symmetry, and parallelism in itself isn't always symmetrical. One within its paradigm and the interpretation as one looks not at the syntax but at the ideology or the ideas that are communicated through the parallelism. And it can also be asymmetrical considering its syntax, how many stresses there are in the paralleloid themselves. So I just wanted to bring that up as an important idea. So let's look at prosody. Prosody analysis, the most general term used to refer to the elements or structure elements of structure involved in the rhythmic or dynamic aspect of speech, used sometimes synonymously with metrical analysis, focuses on duration, counting syllables, intensity, count stresses in accents, and pitch. Types of meter. Syllabic, number of syllables, accentual, number of accents, accentual syllabic, and quantitative. The book the green one didn't necessarily go into depth of these, but those are the terms that it gives. Next, rhythmic patterns in poetry typically involve 4 elements. Regularity, regular occurrences for stress 2 and 2, 3 and 3, such as found in Eugeritic. Variation, number of syllables present in cola, vary from next to next. Grouping, grouping of words making 2 or 3 accented bicola or tricola, such as evil, wicked, righteous, good. Hierarchy, patterns on lower levels of rhythmic series that are frequently repeated across wider spans on hierarchical levels. There is still a continuing debate over what type of meter exists within Scripture. Attempts to reconstruct the text fall into what is known as syllabication, and/or metrikaza is another word. A Hebrew word reconstruction in order to make it reflect the presumed form of the word that would have existed when the poem was composed. So what does this actually mean? And also, why reconstruct the text? How do you even reconstruct the text, first of all, right? So the first point presented in the book is first, the Masoretic text, 700 through 800 AD, includes a complicated system of primary and secondary accentuation markings, a system that is considerably later, 1,000 years plus and more than the poems themselves. So Tiberian vocalization was introduced at least, or we'll just say it's debatable, but let's just say for now 8th century AD, right? 8th or 7th. Now, it's also debatable that Solomonic authorship is a real thing for the poetic books, right? Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, right? Song of Songs. So most scholars just kind of put them around 5th century BC. So if they were written in the 5th century BC, the poetic books, and then the vocalization was created in the 8th century AD, that is a really long time later. So people are trying to quote-unquote rediscover that vocalization that has been lost. Point 2. During the earliest period that Hebrew poetry was being created, there were several major developments in the language that affected the position of accents on given words. For example, in the language spoken in Syria-Palestine during the Late Bronze Age, case endings were present on nouns. The word for word in the nominative case would have been written davaru or davaru, or however you want to say it in modern Israeli, right? With the U, or the U, serving as the nominative case ending. During the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, these case endings fell out of use. Throughout a process of conditioned phonetic change, the syllabic structure and stress of the words that had occurred with case endings became different. So the word for word became devar, with the accent on the second syllable, as it had earlier. So what are the categories of paralleloid that Robert Loth coined? So the three that he created were Synonymous Parallelism, Antithetical Parallelism, and Synthetic, also known as Constructive or Formal Parallelism. Synonymous Parallelism. Simply put, the same thing is restated, by thing I mean paradigm, in different words. This structure can be illustrated in the statement A and nuanced A, or just A and A, but difference in words, right? The clauses of a phrase correspond to one another ideologically despite differences in syntax which can and very well do occur. Any apparent difference in syntactical nuance within the preceding clause is not a focus. Rather, it is their paradigmatic symmetry or full ideological or exegetical restatement. Kugel, for example, would know otherwise in bypassing any subtle change. So, what I'm really saying here is that what is extracted from each clause, which is the part or the piece of a phrase within the parallelism, what is extracted is the idea that is extracted is exactly the same as its proceeding or preceding idea. So, like when it says something like, listen, earth, hear heaven, or listen, earth, hear land. Within this category, Loth would say the same thing is being restated, right? But Kugel disagrees with that, as do I. Antithetical parallelism. The clauses of this phrase answer to one another to construct a unified idea. Through contrasting word pairs, the antithesis forms this reality. This structure can be illustrated in the phrase A and not A. For example, a wise son makes glad his father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. Proverbs 10:1. So, what Loth is doing here is he's pretty much just saying, like, there's opposite word pairs that are being used, and they pretty much, he's saying, like, opposites make complement each other to create like one single idea, right? Rhyming not through meter, but through ideas, right? But Kugel, in opposition to this, sees antithetical as not even necessarily being antithetical, because nothing is necessarily contradicting itself. It's just something is being complemented or strengthened in its idea. It's not that a wise son makes his father glad and a wise son grieves his mother, but that a wise son makes his father glad and a foolish son his mother, full of grief. So nothing is necessarily being completely contradictory, but there are differences which do make it appear antithetical. Synthetic, constructive / formal parallelism. The parallelism consists only in the similar form of construction, in which a word does not answer to word, sentence to sentence, as equivalent or opposite, but there is a correspondence and equality between different propositions, in respect of the shape and turn of the whole sentence and of the constructive parts. This structure can best be illustrated in the statement A and B, or A plus B. So an example of this in Scripture is, food he gives to his fearers. That's the first clause. He remembers his covenant forever. That's the second clause. So, paradigmatically, how does one associate the two clauses, right? So it's not synonymous, it's not antithetical. It is speculated that the author intentionally leaves out the definitive or explicit association between the bicola. The poet has chosen this structure to aid contemplation and the discovery of an underlying relationship, whether that be strictly one or more. Depends on the hermeneutical lens, right? So if you're a relativist, you'd probably be like, oh, it's up to you. But maybe if you take perhaps a historical grammatical perspective, you'll say there's one, right? Many others as well. But the interpretation of these clauses or the association, right? The notion of giving food to those in a relationship, the fearers, with God may be easily extended by the expression of the remembering of the relationship, namely the covenant. So as God remembers the covenant, he gives, or remembering the covenant is God giving food to his fearers. However, Kugel is a bit critical of this perspective as well, because he feels as though it's a oversimplification, an overgeneralization of parallelism, in that it tends to overlook the wider range of intricacy that's used in many of the writers. So yeah, it can oversimplify the larger range of intricacy that can exist in their structure. Semantic elements. From a linguist's perspective, the semantic relationship in parallel lines, like the lexical relationship between word pairs, can be viewed as either paradigmatic or syntagmatic. In this case, the second line may be perceived as a result of the first, in which case there would be a semantic sequence or syntagm. That's Berlin A. So what does that even mean, right? So let's look at two different layers of the word, which are important for interpretation and likewise. So syntagmatic analysis. In semiotics, syntagmatic analysis is analysis of syntax or surface structure, as opposed to paradigmatic analysis. Syntagmatic means that one element selects the other element, either to precede it or to follow it. For example, the definitive article the selects a noun, not a verb, as found in English, right? So, for example, in Hebrew, the definitive article the attaches is attached to the noun. So haaretz, right? The land is not two words, but it's one word, right? Or the word et is a helps one find the direct object, right? So it's like the hard grammatical structure of the syntax, right? How the language actually functions. That's one level, right, of the word. Then there's the paradigmatic analysis. That's what is interpreted in what the words are saying and how the words are used and how they're structured, right? So paradigmatic analysis is the analysis of paradigms embedded within the text rather than the surface structure, syntax of the text, which is termed syntagmatic analysis. Paradigmatic, on the other hand, uses communication tests, i.e. substituting words of same class or type to calibrate shifts in connotation. So it's about the idea that's being extracted. One could say that paradigmatic analysis, at least in my perspective, is the result of exegesis, right? What one actually derives from, the word, aside from grammar, right? How the grammar functions. So syntagmatic relationships continue to advance the relationship. Paradigmatic substitutes different words which unify single entities or ideas within a paradigm, also known as word pairs. But we'll keep those in mind for later. Phonological elements. Sound equivalencies may be activated in parallelism, just as grammatical, lexical equivalencies are. Often this takes the form of sound pairs, the pair of terms that are phonologically equivalent, i.e. they contain the same or linguistically related consonants. In some cases, the sound pair are also word pairs. More often, it seems, sound pairs are not lexical or semantic pairs. They may not even be from the same word or class. Several sound pairs may occur in parallelism, and they may be patterned in different ways, chiastically as AABB, ABAB, ABBA. The effect of sound pairs is to reinforce the bond created by the other forms of equivalence between the parts of parallelism. Sound pairs provides an added dimension, an additional type of linguistic equivalence. The more equivalences there is in a parallelism, the stronger the sense of correspondence between one line and the next is. This, in turn, promotes the perception of semantic unity. The various linguistic equivalencies may act in concert, or they may produce an artistic tension, creating an interplay that adds to the interest of the parallelism. So practically it's saying it's a literary technique, and that sound and the sounds of the words and how closely associated they are create an artistic expression. Let's look at some concrete examples of phonological parallelism in the Hebrew. So let's begin with assonance. So assonance is the repetition of a vowel. So the key sound to look out for here is the cholam. In Genesis 49:17 it says, Yehi dan nachash ale derech shefifon ale orach hanoshech ikve sus v'yipol roch vo achor. So it's pretty much the cholam. Alliteration is the repetition of a consonant, which is on the next slide, and the acrostic play on alphabet. So here is Proverbs 31:14 through 31. So if you know Hebrew, you can see at the beginning of each verse the alphabet played out, right? So you have the Aleph, the first verse, right? You have the Bet, the Gimel, the Dal, the Hey, the Vav, the Chaf, the Kaf, right? So on. And then it ends with the Tav at the end, which is a really cool way for the Book of Proverbs to end on an acrostic or alphabetical prose. As promised, alliteration. So let's look at these in Hebrew and English, right? So a whip, shot, for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod, shevet, for the back of fools. May there be peace, shalom, within your walls, and security, shalva, within your citadels. A good name, Shem, is better than fine perfume, Shemin. The day of death, better than the day of birth. Drink water from your own cistern, borecha, running water from your own well, be'erecha, Proverbs 5:15. Simile and metaphor. Simile, a figure or speech in which two entities are compared. The comparison is usually created morphologically, namely by an indicator or of resemblance, such as the word like or as, right? So metaphor, a figure of speech in which a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them, as in drowning in money, broadly figurative language, right? So that's Merriam-Webster. I. Richards speaks of tenor and vehicle. The tenor is the idea being expressed, or the subject of the comparison. The vehicle is the image by which this idea is conveyed, or the subject communicated. So an example of simile is this rainbow, tenor. Trout glistens like fire. So this rainbow trout glistens like fire. So in this case, the rainbow is the tenor, vehicle is the fire. So in a metaphor, right? The fish is a stroke of lightning. So here the stroke is the tenor and the vehicle is the lightning. Identify the tenor in what is being modified. So in my understanding, I identify the tenor as being modified, accentuated, extending, and one may identify the vehicle as the teleos, or the telos, or final form of culmination presented, the culmination of description, right? So in the metaphor, right, the stroke or the lightning is like the extent of the stroke, and the way I understand it is that the fire is the culminative form of the rainbow. A simile distances tenor and vehicle, whereas metaphor approximates them. Harold Finch. fish, however you say that. Simile, tenor, metaphor, tenor, vehicle. That's kind of the way I see it. Alternative paralleloid. Chiastic, staircase, emblematic, Janus. Chiastic parallelism. A chiasm, also called chiasmus, is a literary device in which a sequence of ideas is presented and then repeated in reverse order. Or there's many other orders, but the result is a mirror effect as the ideas are reflected back in a passage. Each idea is connected to its reflection by a repeated word, often in a related form. The term chiasm comes from the Greek letter chi, not sure how to say it, I don't know Greek, just Hebrew, which looks like our letter X. Chiastic pattern is also called ring structure. As a type of parallelism in which the balanced elements are presented in reversed order rather than in the same order. It is useful for creating a style of balanced form that offered by regular parallelism, since chiasmus reverses the order. Example, ABBA, additional sets include ABC, CBA, etc. So an example of this is in Joel 3:17-21. God dwells in Zion, right? ABCX, CBA. You can get into that. We're also going to get into chiasms when we get to Kugel's perspective, but until now, we'll hold off. Emblematic parallelism. This is one of my favorites. Emblematic parallelism is constructed with a symbol or metaphor, an emblem, that is placed side by side in parallel with its meaning. A verse that exhibits emblematic parallelism will feature an illustration and its interpretation, an extended simile or an ancient object lesson, as it were. Like an earring of gold or an ornament of fine gold is the rebuke of a wise judge to a listening ear, right? So a listening ear is like, or an ear that listens on a person is like, fine gold ornament, right? Another example, like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death, is a man who deceives his neighbor and says, I'm only joking, right? So seeing coarse humor as, an arrow that damages, right? So that's kind of cool. Janus Parallelism. This one's also really cool. Janus Parallelism is a recently discovered tool evident in ancient Hebrew poetry. Like the two-faced Roman god Janus, Janus Parallelism employs a Hebrew word with two meanings that faces two ways. One meaning of the word relates to the preceding text, while the other meaning of the word relates to the following text. Cyrus Gordon discovered and named this technique in a 1978 publication where he examined a verse in Song of Solomon 2:12. The blossoms appear in the land the time of the Zamir, pruning season / music. Pruning season, right? And then you look at that same word, and then it's like, Zamir, music, has arrived, and the song of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The blessings of your fathers surpass the blessings of my ancestors, mountains, to the utmost bounds of the eternal hills. So the word is found, right, so the Janus word is found in the middle of a parallelism. And considering that word retrospectively, paradigmatically, it comes to life. And then also considering the word prospectively, it changes the paradigm and it becomes something a little different, right? So I have an example of this later, but look it up, it's really cool. So now we have arrived at the meat of our presentation. This is the guy I'm really doing most of my just kind of research off of. So this is Parallelism or Paralleloid of James Kugel, 20th to 21st century, right? So he perceives parallelism as emphatic, heightening, concentrating, specifying, accentuating, and going beyond in force. The equivalence and or opposition within the correspondence may be furthered at grammatic and semantic levels. A is so and what's more B is so is too limiting a description of the correspondence. A is related to B at a multiplicity of grammatic and semantic levels. The correspondence of A and B is not merely A plus B, nor A greater than B, nor A smaller than B. we must carefully observe the individual words as well as their relationships at the level of colon, multicolon, and entire poem in order to comprehend the range of parallelisms utilized in the Hebrew Bible. So this is taken from his book. We are asserting basically a sequence. First part, pause, next part, bigger pause, right? So that is the syntagmatic structure, or it's the structure of the syntax that he believes is the fundamental essence of biblical parallelism. And only secondarily on the rough limits on the length of the clause and their approximate equivalents. But even this sequence is a bit of a shorthand for the real point, for what those pauses actually embody is the subjoined, hence emphatic character of B. The briefness of the brief pause is an expression of B's connectedness to A. The length of the long pause is an expression of the relative disjunction between B and the next line, right? Or like a phrase or a maxim and the next maxim, right? So like that's so that the flow of like Proverbs doesn't or the flow of the Proverbs that are found in Proverbs don't, spill into one another and confuse the reader, right? So those pauses help disassociate the ideas from one another so that, they're concise and they're readable and they don't become confusing, right? What this means is simply B, by being connected to A, carrying it further, echoing it, defining it, restating it, contrasting with it, it does not matter which, has an emphatic seconding character, and it is this, more than any aesthetic of symmetry or paralleling, which is at the heart of biblical parallelism. So this page is really important. So this is the syntagmatic structure. So you can see here A, and the arrow pointing to A, and then the arrow pointing to B. So that is practically the retrospective and prospective elements of parallelism. So let's just get into it. There is a medial pause between A and B, which, according to Kugel, should not be interpreted as an equal sign, as it is with Loth or the paradigmatic break of sharpness within some rabbinic circles. The double arrow both symbolizes and stresses the unity between the two parts syntagmatically. It also illustrates the typical paradigmatic nuance, still connected ideologically, between the two clauses. Such is achieved through the retrospective, looking back to A from B, and prospective, looking beyond A at B, quality. However, the degree of paradigmatic symmetry ranges on a continuum between zero perceptible correspondence to near zero differentiation. Thus, for parallelism, aside from strict phonological symmetry and Loth's synthetic category, this general diagram, in my opinion, is pretty good. It's pretty awesome. Categorization of types is numerous. A great way to understand parallelism is to look at the structure of a specific verse. It is virtually impossible to encapsulate all exceptions within a general universal principle. Attempting to do so can lead to perceptual construing and or deviation from identifying the nature of a structure's syntagmatic design. Such causes loss in paradigmatic material, affecting the reader throughout their experience of their selected poetic theory, right? So practically what I'm saying is that if you view A equals B, you are bound to lose the exegesis that would be found if you saw the nuance or the ideological development as B transfigures in, or as A transfigures into B and B looking back to A. So if you look at them equally, you lose material. And if you look at them as completely different within the rabbinical lens of sharpness, you will also lose material because you lose the connection and the association between the two. So extremes can be a downfall. That's not to say that they don't exist, but be aware of it. That's all I'm saying. Alright, so let's look at the way B is actually syntagmatically or through syntax connected to A. So expression of B is subjunction to A. That is a connection, right? So incomplete B completed by reference to A, i.e. ellipsis in B, Most typically, the subject or verb appears in A and is implied in B. All of B is in apposition to a single term in A. Incomplete A, completed by B. Rare, but occurs, for example, in Psalms 27:3. Actual repetition of a term in B. So phonological parallelism. Pair words, right? Righteous, the good, right? The sinful, the wicked, right? Sequentiality, subordination express or implied in the katal, ekatal verb tense, also known as the complete or incomplete, perfect or imperfect tenses. Unusual word order, chiasmus, so it's ABBA, ABAB order. And then lastly is the final pause. B has a closural quality that allows it to break a discourse into fairly short units, organizing the flow of clauses into twos and threes. Chiasm, ABBA, and so forth. From what I understand of Kugel, parallelism's chiastic use opposes restatement and loathes synonymous category. For example, the syntagmatic word order and verbal tenses which alternate between the perfect and imperfect illustrate the intention not to parallel. Such alternation is not rare, but extremely common. By its very vastness, not accidental, but chosen, and or the style of speaking. To have multiple different forms of verbs and other lexical elements, such as nouns, prefixes, etc., in different arrangement than their preceding clauses, is the decision not to parallel the word order of A. Grammatical restatement, in his view, is undermined. My only question is how syntax opposes Lowe's paradigm of synonymous parallelism. What is the relationship between grammatical restatement and paradigmatic symmetry? Anyways, what I'm saying here is that so the actual sequence within clauses, such as the noun followed by a verb followed by a direct object, etc. Just for example, oftentimes does not follow the exact same sequence in the preceding clause. So the preceding clause and the preceding clause of parallelism typically don't follow the same grammatical arrangement as each other. They're a little mixed up, in that mixing up is, according to Kugel, it illustrates an intentional decision not to parallel the words. Chiastic differentiation. So this is how chiasms are different, how to identify them, elements of chiasms, right? Apposition of a word with a possessive suffix in A, with an article in B, and vice versa. Changes from one grammatical person to another, first person, second person, third person. Omission of a pronominal suffix, his, your, my, in one verse half when present in the other. Prepositional alternation. Omission of prepositions, conjunctions, interrogative particles, negations, and other particles from one clause. The differentiating all, also known as the col or the whole, that typically exists at the end of a clause. Eugeritic. Ancient Near Eastern literature, such as found in Eugeritic, provides insight into the structure of parallelism. Through its close resemblance, the following can be identified. The frequency of three-clause sentences, the very common, so one is also known as tricola, the very common appearance of repeated words or phrases in consecutive clauses, and the existence of a stock vocabulary of pair words. So pair words, again, are things like good, holy, sinner, the wicked, right? Those are typical pair words that you see. And the language Ugaritic, which is very close in its style to Hebrew, also shares those common elements. Ternary line, breaking the monotone. Now, all three-clause sentences illustrate some of the features of parallelism. The basic idea of B answering A, corresponding to it, is confuted by the newcomer C. What is it doing there? The putative rhythm of restatement, statement, restatement, is broken by the ternary line. In Hebrew, such breaks can be viewed as emphatic, intermittent spots of underlining which pleasantly broke the monotony or formed an emphatic closure. So what Kugel is saying here is that in Ugaritic as well as in Hebrew, if literature were to consist only of bicola phrases, it would feel a little monotone, it'd feel a little stale. So what he proposes is that the tricola phrases enable the text of the literature to feel a bit more emphatic, to break the statement restatement that can feel a little boring. So he views the C clause as another element of emphasis. Eugeritic asymmetrical clauses. Ugaritic literature, like Hebrew, also lacks balanced clauses, which leads to numerically asymmetrical words and syllables. Considering this, to form balanced clauses is not the point. Rather, it is to heighten one's attention and emphasize the idea. So what Kugel proposes is that the main point of Ugaritic literature, which he also supposes or assumes upon Hebrew, is not to balance the clauses as is found in metrical literature, to have exactly symmetrical, stressed accents and syllables and consonants. Rather, the point is to catch one's attention, is to heighten the idea or emphasize. Parallelism main points. What is poetic is the breaking up of such proverbial pairs, or more generally, of any conventionally associated concepts into adjacent clauses, to establish the interclausal connection and the feeling of closure. So what Kugel is saying here is that what is really unique about parallelism, and what he believes to be really poetic actually about it, aside from meter, is that it has the ability to encapsulate both difference as well as similarity. Paradigmatically, sometimes the only connection or association between the parallelism is actually just the word pair, and everything else but the word pair is super different. It doesn't really even have a relationship, as can be demonstrated in Loth's synthetic category. So Kugel just sees the relationship, or the poetry really is just the ability to encapsulate difference and similarity at the same time. Parallelism, poetry and prose. Parallelism as an element is not exclusive to the Bible's poetic books, like Proverbs or Job. Parallelism can be found concentrated in prophetic books such as Isaiah and even laws within the Torah. Kugel suggests poetry and prose to be on a continuum, and considers the polarity of such a distinction to be too sharp, as well as a Hellenistic imposition of rhetoric spanning from the classical period's belief, so on, of biblical meter. So practically, it's really interesting. Kugel identifies parallelism even within the Torah, within laws, and how this piece of literature, this rhetorical technique, is not exclusive to the quote-unquote poetic books, but is found literally, practically in every book of the Bible. And that the distinction is too extreme, that it's practically an overgeneralization and can lead to overlooking the intricacies in some books, because one naturally assumes that because it's quote-unquote prose, it may not contain certain rhetorical features. So he believes parallelism, as he presents it well, is broader and is on a greater continuum than the Hellenistic imposition proposes. Classical period parallelism and rabbinical hermeneutics. It's a bit of a mouthful, but because it's specific, it helps get to the point, And here I just want to look at 4 elements and dive into them to see how they contributed to the overarching perspective upon parallelism, and as well as parallelism's re-identification, in my opinion. So, the paradigmatic and syntagmatic relationship between parallelistic pieces had not yet merged in this period. Such came to be considered here the influence of 4 factors. The first, the omnisignificance principle. Second, the decline of synagogal antiphony. Third, the introduction of cantillation marks via Tiberian vocalization, also known as Nicolot, and sticography. The omni-significance principle, very important. This lens of interpretation is referred to as sharp because its method is to, as I'm understanding it, ideologically distinguish parallelism ranging from zero perceivable correspondence, but more importantly here, to the near zero differentiation, to see what initially appears as the same as different in parallelism, right? Interestingly, parallelism exhibiting high symmetry, paradigmatically, saw A and B as paradigmatically separate cases. In addition, the concept of biblical restatement rested on rhetorical grounds. For classical rabbis, the divinity of the text excluded literary devices, as they in themselves were perceived as originating in man. Repetition thus prohibited preceding clauses to appear to retain meaning, for how could they be divine if what was present was just mere echo of its previous form? So practically, the rabbis in the classical period did not consider the idea of repetition to be divine, and in our eyes, or rather, paradigmatic restatement in their eyes was practically inconceivable. Alright, so let's continue to explore this Hermeneutical lens, right? Omni-significance. So the Mishnah, the Targum, Yerushalmi, and other rabbinic writings like the Midrash or Rabbah take parallelistic pieces and assert a paradigmatic difference in the clauses. I also just wanted to say how cool it is for these books to have included other minority standpoints. They make the effort to bring in other opinions, which is interesting. So, for example, here is an excerpt from Genesis Rabbah on Genesis 21:1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. So, as we hear that today, we'd practically say, okay, that's the exact same thing being said. For the rabbis, it's different in the classical period, right? So, and the Lord remembered Sarah as he had said, this is the Rabbah, refers to promises introduced by the verb say, devar. And the word did for Sarah as he had spoken means promises introduced by spoke, amar. Rabbi Nehemiah said, as he had said means as he had said by means of an angel. As he had spoken means he himself. Rabbi Yehuda said, and the Lord remembered Sarah to give her a son, and the Lord did for Sarah to bless her with milk to nurse that son. Rabbi Nehemiah objected, had anything been openly announced about her nursing yet? But if you do wish to base a distinction on remember versus do, let this verse teach us that what God did for Sarah was return her to her youthful condition. So practically, what happens in the rabbinical perspective is that when the Jews and the rabbis were observing parallelistic pieces, they practically entirely disassociated them paradigmatically from each other. So there was less of an opportunity to see paradigmatic development occurring in the parallelisms because they were disassociated from one another and isolated from one another and practically became their own cases. The decline of antiphony. So what is antiphony? Antiphony is alternating or responsive singing by a choir in two divisions. Antiphony is mentioned in Ugaritic and Babylonian writings. So this here is an excerpt from Kugel. For here, antiphony in the synagogue, the precise nature of this heightening device comes into its full value. The seconding of meaning makes it easier for the chorus to complete the verse responsively or repeat the second part of the leader. Thus, antiphony adheres to the medial and final pause of the syntax and highlights B's subjunction to A through the seconding nature of responding. So let's take, for example, we're in the synagogue, right? This is like, let's just say, 3rd century BC, right, or something. And we're in the synagogue and we come across a piece and it says something like, listen, earth, hear, O land, right? So the choir director would read something like "Listen, Earth," and then the chorus or the community would read "Hear, O Land," and so the distinction was accentuated by the difference in those who responded, and it highlighted and it really contrasted B's subjunction to A, and it kind of enlightened and continued to enlighten the parallelistic syntagmatic structure. I know it's a mouthful, but just trying to get it out. The decline of antiphony. So here's an excerpt again from Kugel. But antiphony gradually disappeared from the synagogue, prayers, and rendition of the Bible, whether owing to a general decline in Jewish learning among congregants, making their participation lackluster and undesirable, or to the monopolistic of the Hazan, Jewish musician trained in the vocal arts. This disappearance became noticeable as early as the 9th century. Musical rendering of the Psalms and other parallelistic parts of the service became more and more of the Hazan's exclusive property, and his dominance of the liturgy was fixed by the 10th or 11th century. When antiphony had previously been the norm, solo performance now took over. Complementing this specialization was a general decrease in the amount of material musically rendered at all. What had been sung before was now spoken or whispered. So practically, in the past, what was more easily distinguishable based on those who were designated to response in certain ways, right? The responding itself heightened the distinguishability of the clauses declined. As that declined and as people became more specialized in singing, that distinguishability became less apparent, and parallelism itself as an entity being identified began to also decrease. Between the 7th and 10th century, the Masoretes introduced the Tiberian cantillation. At first, the tradition began simply to clarify the textual ambiguities of pauses and breaks. However, the complexity of the cantillations grew, and the communal practice of seconding through repetition began to subside. Music became the new focal point as it sought to increase the pleasurable senses of harmony and pitch, whilst placing specialization in liturgical matters through few hazan. As specialization increased, there was no need for congregational responding, and thus the communal practice for the poem in the ear fell out of the synagogue. So what was once more easily distinguishable through listening and through the ear was replaced by music, which was a new form of sound through the ears, and that changed the distinguishability. Schematization of antiphony. 4 antiphonal patterns attested from rabbinical sources. You can look at this if you're interested, but I'm going to go to the following slide. The introduction of cantillation marks via Tiberian vocalization, also known as the nikulo. 3 systems of annotating telmim into written text in Hebrew have been evidenced. They are known as the Palestinian, Babylonian, and Tiberian systems. The Tiberian, the most detailed and the most recent, is a system currently in use. It was perfected by the Masoretes of Tiberias, who also developed the current vocalization of the biblical text. Telmim, accents which nowadays refer to a written system of graded pauses, a kind of punctuation of the text that indicates full stops, various short pauses, and run-ons. Originally, however, the term seems rather to have designated the oral parsing of the text into its sense units. Children learning to recite were taught where to pause and where to continue. I'll wrap this information in the next slide. The Masoretic scribes, which created the Tiberian vocalization, introduced the medial and final pause, which enabled textual ambiguities to be further clarified. At the beginning of the tradition before musical cantillation was adopted, the system, according to Kugel, comprised of simple pauses and breaks. As it developed over time, scribes added special telmim, whose purpose is unknown, to books concentrated in parallelism. Most importantly, however, the medial pause, occasionally, broke B's subjunction to A. This means that in some sections as one sings through the telmeme, one also deviates syntagmatically from the parallelistic structure. On account of musical authority, the medial pause began to more loosely adhere from the initial place of subjunction. Recognizing parallelism syntax now became obscured as a new structure overpowered the former. So, as one sang the text, there were new breaks that were introduced to the text, and in these new breaks, B's subjunction to A and the pause, the connecting pause, their syntagmatic pause, which was also a sign of connection, was also obscured, and this diluted somewhat the ability to recognize parallelism's connecting syntax. Sticography. So what is it? Its definition is the spacing of verses and verse halves. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain sticography as a distinctive feature, marking passages as special. By the time the Dead Sea Covenanters, this spacing had acquired a distinctive or decorative function quite apart from indicating parallelistic breaks, and it was used for spoken as well as sung text. Not was it, as far as can be determined, required by current fashion for any particular text or class of text at this point. So what it's saying is that sticography, by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, did not adhere to the breaks of parallelism, but rather was a decorative feature. According to Kugel, no doubt the form of sticography found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is already somewhat conventionalized, and, as noted, a decorative device. Yet one might fairly see in this a reflection of a still earlier practice, witnessed in the scribal practice of other ancient Near Eastern texts, in which special spacing followed singing arrangements and/or parallelism. These systems antedate, or predate, the written telmeme, and indeed compensated for their absence. But the time passed, the spacing grew more and more remote from actual parallelism, and more entwined with the telmeme and with the rules governing spacing, paragraphing, in the prose sections of the Bible. The poem in the eye was finally down to 4 songs in the whole Bible. So sticography, originally, as is illustrated in other ancient Near Eastern scribal practices, arranged the clauses according to their breaks, but as traditions, or just as the rules for paragraphing and new rules for paragraphing came in, parallelism, as one read it, changed in its actual structure, which also changed in identifying it syntagmatically as well as paradigmatically. So sticography, as a developing tradition, later on changed its identification. At some point in time, even before the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the songs in Paralleloid are speculated to have been sectioned out according to their bicola and tricola subjunctions. For whatever reason, the spacing changed and was divided into sections, which tore apart the tricola paralleloi, forcing the final clause to attach to neighboring parallels, thus causing confusion for a reader. Such change in format may be attributed to the elegance associated with a bicola-like structure, exhibiting a desirable flush and symmetrical shape / consistency. Classical period parallelism and hermeneutics of the Church. Allegoria, also known as allegory in Greek, translates to another speaking and is a type of hermeneutics. Kugel speaks of 3 motives for allegorizing. 1. The impulse to allegorize in all these cases comes at least in part from a perceived contradiction or inconsistency within the text, or between the text and something outside it. 2. A second motive for allegorizing is to lift the discourse from the specific to the general, and in the case of the Bible to turn what is historical and particular into something universal and hence potentially personal. Third, beyond the harmonizing and generalizing accomplished by allegory, there is another typically Greek appeal to it. It makes apparently straightforward utterances antinomic. The text becomes a surface, concealing essences of universal dimension beneath it. For the allegorist, the text's holiness resides in its multiplicity, in the fact that it can be read on 2, 3, or 4 different levels. Of these, its surface meaning is the least important, often even incidental. The significance of the interpretive lens is, as we will see, how allegorists claim to know the metrical, and hence syntagmatic structure of the text, while seeking for the concealed paradigmatic truth. In this sense, emphasizing a metrical knowledge of the syntax as allegorists, who deviate from syntax to emphasize the paradigm. So what's interesting is that as an allegorist, one does not emphasize or place main importance on syntax, but rather upon the paradigm. So it's interesting seeing how classical period scholars, as allegorists, claim to know the metrical structure, which deals in the opposite of the paradigm, which is the syntagmatic. Connected to this phenomenon, Greek influence, is the firm belief of the Greek poetry, philosophy, and other learning had originated with the Hebrews. The roots of this notion are pre-Christian. It was a Jewish bulwark against the inroads of Hellenization, but one that, at the same time, helped Jews to accept Greek learning without conceding it priority or even originality. Thus, Aristobulus of Panias reports that even before the Septuagint, Jewish wisdom was translated and spread among the Greeks. The origin of Hellenism attributed to the Jews. Philo, 20 BC through 50 AD, claimed in his book The Contemplative Life that biblical poetry consisted of hexameter, trimeter, pentameter, as well as other Greek meter. Before the pre-Christian period, Hellenistic Jews claimed philosophy, poetry, and specifically Greek wisdom to be theirs, as was explicitly stated by Aristobulus of Panias, 2nd century. Clement of Alexandria, 150 through 215 AD, having also been associated with Aristobulus, claimed Hebrew wisdom was stolen by the Greeks. Such encouraged the assimilation of Jews towards Hellenistic culture. No exact evidence, however, of how the scriptures contained meter was provided. Only their claims persisted until the medieval times for Jews and the Renaissance for Christians. Theodore of Mopsuestia, 350 through 420 AD, if I'm saying that right, refers to parallelism as diaresis, meaning dividing in two. What Theodore noticed was that A and B make a single whole, and that their parallelism is significant. Even if distribution is somewhat reductive, simplified, it at least recognizes parallelism and recognizes it as a device, as artful speech. So he sees parallelism as a unified whole, which brings in the element of the syntagmatic unity, which I believe is one of the first to identify that. So here I have a diagram of the traditions. If you want to pause and look at it, you can. But here is the tradition of allegory, tradition of poetry and meter, as well as the developing tradition of parallelism, and who passed on what to who in a very simplified form. So how do we really come to the idea that some books are poetic and some books are not poetic, right? So this section is parallelism and poetry associated. Augustine read parallelism as a heightening feature of Greek style, and it would then be that such a feature, considering Hellenistic literature, would appropriately accommodate poetry. Such was deemed a typical literary figure destined to be read belonging to the Greco-Roman arsenal. Once assimilated and re-identified with Hellenistic arts, it would take until the Renaissance for the Church to re-examine parallelism, and so begin to disassociate its content from the belief of biblical meter. So in the Greco-Roman world, there are typical styles of composing metrical poetry, and a literary type that also happened to be in the Greek poetry was repetition. And so in seeing repetition through Hellenistic eyes, it was it was, what is the word? I guess it was just really imposed and by default assumed that such a rhetorical figure would be naturally accommodated by the presence of meter. Alright, this is our last period, and this is medieval period parallelism and rabbinical hermeneutics. Menachem B. Jacob, 920 through 970 AD, Rashi, 1040 through 1105, and Rashbam, 1085 through 1158, Ibn Ezra, 1089 through 1164, and David Kimchi, I believe, 1160 through 1235, introduce ideological repetition. Of these, Abraham Ibn Ezra perceives such repetition as emphatic and a habit of the language. In his own words, he, Ibn Ezra, states the idea is repeated according to that practice by which one idea is spoken twice in different words. They repeat for the sake of emphasis. Deuteronomy 32:7, he then states, the idea is repeated for this as a form of eloquent speech. In his book Clear Speech, he says, if someone should cite the example of a verse, and the earth and the land were unformed, Psalm 92, I would answer that the first words eretz, or eretz, is a general name for the inhabited and uninhabited parts, while the second word, teval, means specifically the inhabited part. But if one objected that there then is no need to specify the assertion for a part that is included in the whole, I would answer that this is how the divinely inspired speak. For does it not also say both the sons of Adam and the sons of man? So the significance is that, the significance we'll get into as this perspective begins to contradict the omni-significance rabbinical principle. But it's important to note that these rabbis and Jewish thinkers during this time period are the first of such to introduce the idea of paradigmatic repetition. Rashi, Rashbam, and Ibn Ezra all introduce the idea of repetition. Such use the word kefel lashon, meaning to double or repeat. According to my interpretation of Kugel, it appears that Rashi uses it to refer to literal repetition, whereas Rashbam and Ibn Ezra use more loosely associated reiteration and restatement. It is deeply important to note that such individuals were heavily influenced by the Mishnah and the Talmud, which in themselves follow the principle of omni-significance. According to this hermeneutic, for the word to restate itself and or be of rhetoric is not only contradictory, but when been considered unorthodox and as well as undivine or uninspired. The previous individuals all recognized repetition, but only in the face of predominantly strict phonological parallelism, where words have been literally stated twice. Parallelism did not yet contain a larger recognition for ideological or paradigmatic relationships, primarily on account of the Talmudic/Mishnaic sharpness tradition that they were following. So, practically, what's happening with the Jews is that as they are taking the hermeneutical lens of omni-significance into the Bible, it's beginning to meet its end as it conflicts with the existence of strict phonological parallelism, which is actual restatement. So restatement can't occur in the omni-significance principle. So there is a clash that begins to occur. There's a contradiction that begins to arise. And it's just important to note that these Jewish thinkers are the first to introduce the idea and partially deviate from that hermeneutical tradition. As the Jews began to speak Arabic, the distinction between the word for Arabic poetry and the Hebrew for song became obscured and confusing. Poetry in Arabic is sir, or sir. I'm not sure how to pronounce Arabic, but the Hebrew is shir, shirah. At that time, Spain's music was accompanied with singing, rhyming, as well as meter. Both sticography, an element also of Arabic poetry, and the special tamim of the poetic scriptures reinforced and recontextualized the Hebrew idea of what a song is. Such made it difficult to disassociate modernity's elements from poetry, at least for most. As was seen with the classical period of the Church, Jews attributed the true etymology of Arabic to be Hebraic. The belief not only catalyzed assimilation to Arabic literature, but also perpetuated the idea for a metrical presence within the scripture. So that's the same thing that happened with the Greeks, right? The Hellenistic Jews. They proposed that Greek ways of life were originally theirs, and they assimilated to that tradition. And the same thing is happening, or had happened again, with the Arabic Jews. So deviation from so began with simultaneously believing an original metrical structure to have existed, but having been obscured through time. So what happened was, with modernity's songs, they were always accompanied with singing and all these other elements. So as the Jews, having taken their modern perspective and looked upon the scriptures that were known as songs, whilst also having a word, shir, that was similar phonologically to the Arabic word for poetry, it was very hard to not be convinced that such songs were not accompanied with meter. And so with the assimilation of different cultures colliding and merging into one another, the concept of biblical poetry still began to persist. Some eventually said, okay, there is no meter, or at least there was meter, but it's no longer observable. And some said, no, there's no trace of it to be found. To me, this is one of the most interesting pieces of this presentation, but Moses ibn Tibbon, who lived between 240 and 1803, was a Jew who composed poetry within Arabic prosody as Spain underwent influences of the East. From my understanding of Kugel, his lens of Arabic literature enabled him to perceive that of the closer binary structure and thus syntagmatic essence for the first time aside from meter in Jewish circles. In imposing and perceiving through the structure of Arabic poetry, aside from its meter and rhyme, he identified the brief and long pause, which is also the syntagmatic connection between the clauses. With the identification of a more generalized binary structure, concerned with syntagmatic connection, parallelism was able to more fully develop. So practically, with the introduction of Arabic poetry into Hebraic circles, Jews were able to use the syntagmatic structure of that poetry to, at least in mine and Kugel's perspective, rediscover the syntagmatic relationship between the clauses, specifically to rediscover the pauses in the paralleloid. In his words, Ibn Tibbon, he states, referring to the poetic books, they are verses that are divided up like Arabic-style poetic lines, even though the units are not equal in long and short syllables. This is why they are written short brick over short brick, long over long. Kugel replies to Tibbon, stating, this is a remarkable observation as far as parallelism is concerned, for it recognizes the essence of biblical poems as the binariness of their lines, the fact that a pause separates two corresponding halves. In this binariness, they resemble Arabic-style poems, even though the two halves do not correspond in long and short syllables. The fact that they break into rough equal halves is enough for Ibn Tibbon to classify them as the same category as Arabic poems, viz. Metrical poetry. Alright, so this is the last section. Throughout this project, my friend Jordan and I have been looking at, or really just looking for parallelism and trying to understand it a little bit better, especially because I've been studying Proverbs in Hebrew, and he's been going through Isaiah as well. And we've come across some cool stuff, and here is practically some of what we speculate to have found throughout the process of this project. So let's get it. Isaiah 44:3, it says, Ki etzak mayim al tzameh unozlim al yabasha etzchak ruchi al tarecha uvirchati al tzeetzaecha. So it says in English, for I will pour water on him who is thirsty and floods on the dry ground. I will pour my spirit on your seeds, descendants, and my blessing on your offspring. Here is a possible Janus parallelism where the word zara both refers to the botanical side of its usage as a seed, and on the other hand, in light of the word pair, offspring or descendants. Retrospectively, zara referring to plants, and prospectively to peoples and or offspring. At the same time, nuance and force is developed in the first clause between water and the heightened word pair flood, right? A flood is a more action-orientated form of just simply water. It's a more specific form, one might say, of just simply water itself. As water is poured, so too the Spirit, possibly an atypical emphatic association. The rivers poured on the dry ground also alludes to the generations receiving the blessing. Another emphasis may lay within the plurality of the words. First, water, single, is poured on a single man, then rivers on land, which emphatically paralleled may be spirit on a seed, resulting in blessing on multiple peoples, right? So water poured on one thing, a man, and then rivers on land. So water is poured on a man, and then rivers poured on land, and then spirit on seed, and then blessing on peoples. So it's like single, single, plural, single, 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 plural, right? And then the following scripture, considered paradigmatically, draws on botanic imagery as it states, they will spring up like grass in a meadow, like poplar trees by flowing streams. So as this scripture simply sits in a vacuum, considering the first clause retrospectively in a botanical sense, is strengthened when it's not sitting in a vacuum, and one considers the context that it's placed in, as the other scriptures also talk about, growing seeds and, grass and other things like that. As water is poured on him who is thirsty, A, even rivers upon their dry ground, B, even more so my spirit upon a thirsty descendant of a seed, A, and my abounding blessing upon your offspring, B. So I at least saw this scripture as AB type of thing. Here's another cool one, Proverbs 1:17. Ki chinam mezora harashet beine chol ba'al kanaf, vehim ledamam ye'erovu yitzpenu lenashotam, ken archot kol putzi abatza nefesh ba'alayv yikach. So here it pretty much says, for no reason the net is spread in the eyes of possessors of wings, birds, and they are for their own blood, or they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their souls, right? And then so are the ways of all who take ill-gotten gain. It takes away the Lord of its, or the soul of its Lord he takes, right? So here the actions of the Chatayim, the sinners, end up being reflexive. What is interesting is considering verse 17, where it first appears to initially describe falling victim at the hands of the innocent, as a bird is trapped within a net. However, in consideration of the word for Lord, possessor retrospectively, it may also allude to the state of the sinners. As the Chatayim ambush the innocent, so too they take away their own soul. So the bird that's described as being caught within the net can allude not only to the innocent being trapped by the sinners, but also the sinners themselves as they trap their own selves, as they trap their own souls. So it's just interesting. So just a little thing to point out.